themes that emerges from my World Civ course is the idea that the most successful civilizations in history are those that practice a very high level of cultural and religious tolerance. Of course, I think of our own civilization as one of these successful ones also, for some reason that I will recount a little bit later. But I'm also a historian of early modern European history, that is that period from 1500 to 1800. And my specialty, my passion, for those of you who are familiar with me, is British history. And I teach all phases of British history. And one of the things that I love about British history is that I realize I'm very biased towards the British in this sense, but the British invented civil rights. They did. You know, if you go all the way back to the 13th century, when you had a very rotten king named John who trod upon the rights of his barons and his subjects and the church, who all had very well-defined rights under the law, that they forced him to sign a document known as Magna Carta, in which he agreed to abide by the laws that were constituted in the Middle Ages. Well, 400 years later, on another pivotal occasion, the Glorious Revolution, in which an English Parliament, that is a representative institution that our own Congress is modeled very closely after, they asked their designates for King and Queen William and Mary, who have a lovely little college named after them in Virginia, to approve something known as the Bill of Rights, in which they clearly established that kings were not above the law, that they had to abide by the law, and that the people of England and all social categories had civil rights that needed to be respected. In fact, when we get into the history of modern Britain, it is Britain that, long before we did, abolished slavery. They did in 1833. And this was a nation that established its own form of social security way back in 1908. And in 1948, after all the people of Britain had worked so hard together to defeat Hitler in World War II, that the British government realized that health was a basic civil right also. In 1948, they implemented the National Health Service, which established a right to basic health care for every citizen of Britain, something that, of course, was only recently accomplished in this country. And in 2005, they established those civil unions that recognized basically a contractual union-like marriage for same-sex couples. And only recently, the conservative government that governs England right now, or rather Great Britain right now, the more or less equivalent of Republicans, have made establishing gay marriage a part of their platform for 2015. So I always, well, I'm biased, I know, but I think of Europe as always being a bit more progressive in many areas than the United States have been. So, like many other North Carolinians, I was saddened and pretty much shocked by the outcome of May's primary election, in which 61% of voters approved a constitutional amendment defining marriage as only between man and woman and prohibiting all forms of rights, privileges, and benefits for all unmarried couples. You know, this amendment went far beyond just defining marriage. But the voters made their decision. Now, as a historian with a pretty good perspective on history, it occurs to me that this nation has reached a rather disturbing and reactionary constitutional watershed as states pass amendments in order to legislate inequality into their constitutions. And if you look at just a cursory examination of these 30 such amendments across the nation, they really do not reveal any form of cogent legal justification concept of a timeless and sacrosanct institution of marriage. But mostly, they testify to widespread misunderstanding of what the institution of marriage actually means. In fact, marriage exists on a variety of levels. For instance, in one form of marriage, a man and a woman, or perhaps two men or two women, they fall in love. Happens all the time. They decide that they want to get married, and they want to establish a family reunion. And they go into a church, and they exchange holy vows in front of the clergyman, who subsequently unites them in a state of matrimony in the eyes of God. This, of course, is one particular form of marriage. And in the history of Europe, in the Middle Ages and early modern period, just the fact of saying that I will marry you was actually considered to be a legal and binding form of marriage. Or simply just to walk into a church and have a clergyman perform a marriage ceremony. You were sealed for life. However, in today's day and age, there is another form of marriage, one granted and defined by states. And this is actually what most gay people want. Did I say that I was gay? Did I make that clear to everyone? I'm gay! I actually came here with everyone sort of knowing that I was gay. So a small aside here. You know, when I applied for this job way back in 2003, the occupant of the position that I had actually gone to graduate school with her. And she didn't like it here at Pembroke. She had come from Arizona, a strange place. She didn't like it. And she did have options. And so she said she was going to defend her dissertation, but actually she went and got a job interview at Arizona State University and landed a job. So she came back and said, I'm leaving. So they needed someone really fast, so they put an ad out. And so I had been applying for jobs and not getting anything. And so I applied here. And so she's looking through the applications, and she said, oh, you know, there was 100 of them. And, oh, Charles Beem, you should look at this application. This guy's really good. Give him an interview. Oh, by the way, he's gay. So you might think, oh, how horrible. But you know what? I've been out of the closet for 35 years. So she just did something that I would have done myself, which is to come here and say, I'm gay. So somehow I've gotten away with it. Somehow they tenured me. All right, so there's another kind of marriage that most gay people want. So I've been with my partner Jay for, come in and sit down. I want you to be comfortable. Ah, I will do it. Come in, Jeremy. Thanks for coming. All right, so I've been with my partner Jay for 32 years. We met when we were 12. I thought I would have got a bigger laugh out of that one. All right, so we've been together through thick and thin, sickness and health, happiness and tragedy. And after living in North Carolina for the last 9 years, it's so clear to me I'm a second-class citizen. Because the state I live in will not grant my partner and myself the rights and privileges enjoyed by all couples, straight or gay, in Iowa, New York, the District of Columbia, several other states, and perhaps even more after next week's election. So, we don't want to get dressed up like a bride and groom. We don't even care about going to a church. This is what we want. You know, we own a house. And he's had 2 bouts of cancer. You know, and so we've had to think hard about, you know, what is going to happen to our joint property if one of us, obviously one day one of us is going to predecease the other, okay? guess what? It's a very, very tricky kind of thing. Because what we've had to do is to write wills, have them, notarized, and hope for the best that our families will not challenge these documents. Now, I'll leave my families, they're pretty cool. But, this is off the record, by the way. Jade's family, they're Mormons. So they see the world in a certain kind of way. They've always been nice to me, but I've always suspected that should he die, the gloves will come off. And so he thinks that too. So, the fact is that it bothers me a lot that what we have jointly built up together over 32 years could be taken away from me because we do not enjoy the contractual rights of marriage. That bothers me a lot. So, obviously, again, this is one of those areas where I think the United States is not a very progressive place. If we were to go live in Argentina, or Belgium, Canada, Denmark, Iceland, the Netherlands, Norway, Portugal, even Catholic Spain, even South Africa, as well as Sweden, and apparently even there's parts of Mexico where you can have a gay marriage. I just learned that one today. They're going to allow same-sex couples to marry. So how does this happen? Introduction of same-sex marriage is varied by jurisdiction, resulting from legislative changes to marriage laws or from court challenges based on constitutional guarantees of equality, or the combination of the two. So in these jurisdictions, the idea behind all this is that same-sex marriage is recognized as a political, social, and most importantly, a civil right. So in this country, the push for marriage equality represents the logical progression of a much larger and venerable civil rights movement in this country. So the idea is that, sure, you can go to a church and get married, but does that mean that you have actually a state-sanctioned unit, or union rather? The answer is no. If you want to be able to file a joint tax return, or if you want those legal benefits that marriage confers, then you've got to go down to the courthouse and buy a marriage license. So it's states that decide who gets to get married and who does not. And there is nothing traditional about the way this process has worked. Some of you may know that up until the year 1967, I'm looking at a map here, many states in this country prohibited marriage between people of different races. I'm looking here, and basically it was not until 1967 when a Supreme Court decision basically invalidated all these laws that every single state in the South, from Texas to Virginia, had laws prohibiting marriage between different races. So, in that sense, this sort of blows a hole in the idea of some kind of ahistorical, traditional notion of what marriage actually is. So, yet many conservatives and fundamental Christians sort of love to fall back on the supposedly traditional idea that marriage can only exist between a man and a woman. And if I was to ask you all today, what is the primary reason why people marry, what would that be? Really? Income. Money. Money? Okay. You're giving me the answers that I thought. So I would have expected, I would say that, well, would any of you, even if money was involved or status was involved, are you going to get married to someone you don't love? No. Thank you. So, could we perhaps agree that love is a significant factor in the decision on why anyone gets married? Okay, thank you. All right, back to what I'm doing. All right. So, if love is such a big factor, then if we look at the history of love in the Western tradition, it's not just limited to men and women. In fact, love encompasses relationships between men and men as well as women and women. And as a gay man, I have a few examples to show to you all that exhibit the kind of love that exists between men and men. For instance, how many of you are familiar with the great epic poem, the Iliad by Homer, which recounts the Trojan War? Most people think that Achilles is the great hero of the Iliad, but I'm not buying it. For me, it's Hector. He is the guy that steps up to the plate always, and he dies a heroic death. To me, Achilles is a whiny little guy that hides in his tent until something really pisses him off. And that's when Patroclus gets killed as he dons Achilles' armor and gets killed by Hector. That's why Hector meets his untimely end. You know, the only reason that really Achilles finally gets off his butt and goes into battle was to avenge the death of the great love of his life, at least according to the Iliad. Now, I might be walking on some very treacherous ground here because I'm the department chair of the Department of Religion sitting in this room, but one of my favorite stories from the Old Testament of the Christian Bible is the story of David and Jonathan. Now, it can be interpreted, I suppose, in a lot of different ways, but if we just sort of look at the words themselves, at least the way that they were translated into the King James Bible in the early 17th century, you know, in the book of Samuel, came about that when he had finished speaking to Saul, that the soul of David was knit to the, or the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David. Jonathan, of course, being the son of Saul, the first king of the Israelites. And Jonathan loved him as himself. Saul took him that day and did not let him return to his father's house. Then Jonathan made a covenant with David. Another word for covenant, of course, is contract. And of course, another way to describe a marriage is a contract. Back to my script. Jonathan stripped himself of the robe that was on him, and he gave it to David with his armor, including his sword and his bow and his belt. So David went out wherever Saul sent him and prospered. And Saul sent him over the men of war. So there's really nothing effeminate about the love between two men. David flees into the wilderness. David agrees to hide until Jonathan can confront his father and ascertain whether it is safe for David to stay. And Jonathan approaches Saul to plead David's cause. Then Saul's anger, quote, was kindled against Jonathan. He said to him, "You son of a perverse, rebellious woman, do I not know that you have chosen the son of Jesse to your own shame and to the shame of your mother's nakedness?" Pretty wild stuff, huh? That never pops into any sort of conservative arguments about the traditional notion of marriage. Oh, there's also Alexander and Hephaestion, his, of course, the young lover. Now, Alexander married 25 women as he marched his way across Asia, but the guy always by his side was the young man whose death he took very, very hard. Then there's Julius Caesar. Now remember, Rome, in its imperial heyday, you know, Christianity had not really taken root. That would take several centuries. So the idea of having sexual relationships with men or women, there were no real prohibitions. What was said about Julius Caesar, come in and sit down, come in. I'm glad you're here. It was said that Julius Caesar was every woman's man and every man's woman. You can take that for what it obviously were. Then there's the Emperor Hadrian, an emperor during perhaps the golden age of Roman history. He, of course, had an ill-tempered wife named Sabina, but he had a very young, handsome lover named Antinous, who, after Antinous died tragically in the Nile River in the year 130, Hadrian actually started to build a cult around him, sort of proclaiming he's a god, and there are still today hundreds of representations of this young man that are testaments to Hadrian's great love for this young man. Now, in English history, we have some nice examples also. William Rufus, king in the 11th century, the second of the Norman kings, a very, very manly man, had no desire for women at all, and his court was filled with pretty young boys. Then there is Richard the Lionhearted, the great warrior of the Crusades, who lived, come in.
Do you mind, Charles? I'm sorry, we apologize.
I'm getting it early. That's fine.
I maybe ran out.
I'm almost getting a full house here, so I'm very delighted. Richard the Lionhearted. Again, great king, little use for women. And that was just his personal preference. But most kings did, in fact, marry. Like, say, Edward II, who reigned during the early 14th century. He also preferred the company of men over women, although he made a pretty fatal mistake by ignoring his rather formidable French princess of a wife, subsequently known as the She-Wolf of France. She didn't take it kindly that he ignored her, and she sort of launched in a rebellion against him and toppled him from his throne. And then lastly, James I, the successor of Elizabeth, and of course, the man who commissioned the writing of the most famous and enjoyable translation of the Christian Bible. He also preferred the company of men over women. In fact, the letters that he wrote to his various male favorites undeniably demonstrate the very sincere love he felt for men of the same sex. But none of these men had any notion of trying to marry their favorite partners. What was the purpose, really? Marriage was conceptualized basically through most history as a union to produce children and, even more importantly, to transmit property. And when you study the history of marriage in medieval and early modern Europe, it is primarily a social and economic arrangement. If heterosexually inclined men throughout history married for social and economic gain, they loved where their hearts were. And men who were more interested in emotional and sexual relationships with men, they married also. But again, they also went where their hearts took them. The same with women also. In fact, as we just discussed a little bit earlier, only in modern times, when the primary reason people married for love, did defining marriage become something that was contested. So, where does this concept of gay come from? And what's the difference between gay and homosexual? Well, actually, if you want to get into greater detail about this, in the fall I'm going to be teaching a history of sexuality course in which these kinds of things are developed historically. But in the Middle Ages and the early modern period in Europe, as well as in America, there were no gay people or homosexuals. What there were, and this is how it was understood, were people who committed homosexual acts. So, one was not a homosexual, one was someone that deviated from Christian normal forms. So it's not a mental illness. It was basically considered to be a moral failing, like adultery, fornication. bestiality or practicing witchcraft. And you're making a face. But sodomy, actually, we probably understood it a little bit different today. Sodomy actually is simply engaging in an act one can go in and, of course, feel safe. Well, anyone that feels safe today. We'll talk about the Stonewall riots a little bit later. But so by having this social construct of homosexual and finally one of gay, and gay is different from homosexual in the sense that if one is